Hello lovelies, today we're going to talk about the Catalyst Game Lab announcement and why it has everyone all of a fuss. Now if you want to get into the specifics of the Catalyst Game Lab announcement and the stuff going on behind it, there's a good video by Mage Leader which I will link down below. So why might anyone have an issue with this announcement? After all, it reads as rather milquetoast and has a whole bunch of stuff in it that surely we can all agree with, right? We don't want to see prejudice on the basis of whatever, you know, and we don't want to see people getting doxxed, right? But those kinds of things are already the rules, even if they're not set out in the way that they have set them out. There's a lot of new people to the channel, so when it comes to fusses like this, we tend to zoom out a bit and take a look at the wider issue and the context, give things some background, explain them a bit, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty specifics, because plenty of people will be doing that, like Mage Leader. So if we do that with this, can we understand why this has created an enormously negative reaction? And I think we can. People have been trained over the years, perhaps over about the last 10 years, perhaps a bit longer, to take these sorts of statements in a very negative light, because they don't tend to mean what they say. The message that people are receiving is very different to the message that is transmitted. You've heard of dog whistles and in subtext and so on, and that is a lot of what is going on here. Because previously, when a company has said that their product is for everyone, typically that's not what they mean. They in fact mean that it's not for a group of specific people, often along lines of race, gender or age. Take Wizards of the Coast, for example. They have definitely gone very woke, as some people would call it. So you would think that they wouldn't be embracing, you know, sexism, racism, that sort of thing. And yet we have one of their important people, one of their public relations type people doing a tour and coming out with white men can't leave the hobby soon enough, to paraphrase, but close enough to exactly what he said. Can you be anti-racist and yet say something like that about white people? Can you be anti-sexist and yet say something like that about men? I would say no. Right? Capricorn, who I did a video on recently, have a whole panel about the old school Renaissance and how problematic it is that there is a space of old white straight men. You know, the kind of out and out obvious prejudice that you would think wouldn't be allowed by these sorts of policies. And you can bet your sweet bippy that Capricorn has some of these kind of anti-harassment policies and so on. Now, I'm very left-wing, but I don't regard the exclusion of conservatives, who are what, 50% of the population most places, 30% fairly hardcore conservative. I don't think excluding them is a good thing. I think it's bad for us on the left, as it makes us lazy and unable to argue, and I think it's bad for them. I think it's bad for both of us because it puts both of us into information silos where never the twain shall meet, and so you don't learn to argue for what you believe in, and both groups tend to become more extreme as a result. There's anti-harassment policies at conventions. How can you be against an anti-harassment policy? How can you be anti-harassment? Right? Well, they're not really about harassment generally when you get into them. And when they are, it's in a way that is nightmarish and dystopian, because all it takes is someone to make an accusation. These policies generally say that is sufficient. That's sufficient proof to get you thrown out of the convention with nothing more than someone's say so. And then there's mission creep on these anti-harassment policies. They tend to be about making the environment safe so that nobody runs into anything mildly interesting or disturbing. You know, if you're at a gaming convention and you have a horror game, good luck running any demos of that or having any of the artwork on open display, that sort of thing. You're going to be in trouble, and that's without getting into if you do anything remotely adult. So you can be against anti-harassment policies because they're often not about anti-harassment, but about all kinds of other things. And when they are about anti-harassment, it's nightmarish and dystopian, chillingly plausible. A lot of places also have content bans and anti-criticism policies. Places like DriveThruRPG place certain limitations on content, which aren't necessarily applied evenly. Some people have to jump through more hoops than others. Some people can get away with certain kinds of content that other people can't. And they seem to have this policy of anti-criticism. So I'll shut up there. Even if you're for these kinds of things, I think you should also be upset and annoyed, because this never goes further than surface level pandering. I mean, look at Warhammer, for example, right? They will present as being one thing. They will say things like Warhammer is for everyone and so on, but have they actually made any changes? No, thank God. We're unlikely to ever see female Space Marines. But they will go through the performative side of this, the virtue signalling side of this, in order to get some of the people clamoring for these real changes to shut up. And that's as far as they'll go. I mean, this whole cluster of things has been a problem for over a decade now, where the perception of events, the projection of your ideas onto someone else's motivations is more important than any actual event that went off. Take, for example, the UK Games Expo fuss from a year or two ago. Well, probably longer than that now. I am very old. Where a games master ran a scenario that was taken one way by the players, which wasn't his intention, was never described that way by what he said, and yet their accusation was enough to get him thrown out of the convention and lifetime banned, all because they projected their perception of something onto what he was saying. Or we can look even further back and outside the phanosphere to Elevator Gate in the New Atheist community. This guy asks a woman for coffee while they're riding an elevator. She says no. In any sane world, that would be an end to it. But no, this led to a huge schism within the New Atheist community and really brought the whole thing to an end over someone's irrational fear and projection. People use their protected class status both to attack others and to be taken seriously, and as a shield against criticism, which they reframe as harassment. That strikes me as not particularly useful and also insulting to anybody who has any minority statuses. I have some. I will never use them that way. And I find it patronizing that people have this attitude towards those minority statuses. Does controlling the discourse actually help? Can you get quality, meaningful feedback without open discourse? It can be hurtful to have people disagree with you, but it can also be useful. It can help you improve your product, make it more appealing to more people, or identify your core audience that you need to keep on board, the whales. Do these moves to protect people actually protect people, or does it just create new classes of victims, acceptable targets? I think that. Does it lead to costly mistakes, people leaving, things like the Blaine Pardoe firing? He's very conservative, quite combative, but his book's sold, and isn't that supposed to be what matters within a company? Does deplatforming work? Someone recently in my comments was saying that it does, but I think it depends what you mean by work. It can limit their reach to a certain extent, but it also tends to radicalize people. It tends to legitimize their positions. Unless what they're saying and doing leads to direct harm under the principles of the harm principle, I don't think deplatforming can be justified, and I don't think it works because it just creates two information silos, two echo chambers, which then become more extreme. What do these kind of policies do to conventions and fan communities? Well, I hold your applause, don't go to conventions anymore because of this kind of thing, because I don't feel safe going to conventions anymore. Ironic, given that these kind of policies are supposed to make these events safer, right? Because I know it will just take one arsehole who doesn't like me, and I have been harassed for over a decade at this point, so there are certainly people motivated to do so. It would just take one accusation, and that would be out of the convention, out the travel costs, out the cost of the stock, out the cost of the booth. It's just not worth the risk. And I've seen others far more high profile than me similarly second guessing whether they should go to conventions or not. The artist Jim Burns, famous for his science fiction covers and art books and so on, a giant of that part of fandom and the sci-fi and fantasy business, he's questioning going to conventions because people almost don't dare go and look at his art, some of which indulges in Callipygian female pulchritude, for example. People seem to feel like flipping through his art prints and so on is like being caught looking at the top shelf pornography. So he's not sure about conventions. I've seen the same attitude by a lot of other people, none of whom are necessarily very conservative or bigoted or whatever. They just know the level of risk that is involved, and the money simply isn't there in the business anymore to take those kind of risks. This kind of policy, the subtext, creates rivals like the OSR or one-page war games, 3D printed minis that often skirt other people's IP. I think honourable men can differ and argue and debate and both come away from that better for it. These kind of exclusionary policies do not allow that to happen, do not believe that to be a thing. Conventions and communities ran for decades without this kind of thing, just fine. I think the answer is to give user-level controls where you can block certain people or keywords or so on, or whatever, to control your input, at least when it comes to online. But feedback is valuable, even negative feedback. It's not like you have to listen to it or make any changes if you don't want to, but it's still useful. These kinds of efforts do not do what they set out to do, and they only ever seem to end up harming the companies doing them. These rules are often statements of the obvious, but they have mission creep, where they start to police other things. And this happens because apparatchiks and activists and insane people seem to have limitless endurance. They will keep going at something until they get it. But that doesn't make them right, does it? So yeah, if you have a hard time understanding why such an announcement causes such an enormous fuss and reaction, hopefully that gives you some context that will help you understand it. Sang. Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu. on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough.